John, thanks for inviting me. Always fun to participate in a consensus event. And yeah, as John said, we changed the name of my podcast. It's Sales Enablement with Andy Paul. Podcast was acquired earlier this year by Ring DNA, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So I'm excited that you're joining me today because talking about one of my favorite parts of sales, favorite topics of sales, which is discovery. In fact, I think discovery is actually the single most important, I don't call it step in your selling process because it's not a single step, as I'll share with you later. Unfortunately, that's the way it's viewed too often by too many sellers, but it's the most important part of your selling process. And I really credit effective discovery for almost all the success I've had in my career. So what is the purpose of discovery? So often, as I said, it's sort of relegated these days in our sort of linear, stage-based selling processes. Oh yeah, we go through discovery early on and we've got certain questions we need to have answered, oftentimes sort of set list of questions in order to migrate from discovery stage to the next stage. But the thing is, that's not really the way discovery works. It's not about collecting sort of a set of information about the buyer and their requirements, but it's much more about understanding the context behind the problems they have and the context behind the solutions or the outcomes they want to achieve. So the context is much more than just, yeah, they have this issue getting this done. It's, well, if they have a challenge, what's that mean in terms of their business? Is that preventing them from achieving a certain market share? Is it hurting them financially? If it is, what is the dollar impact? It's getting down to that level where you understand the complete picture behind the problems and the outcomes the buyers are trying to achieve. And that then gives you the power to get into a position of influence with them, this trusted advisor that you won't get to if you just look at discovery as just collecting bits of information. So speed to discovery, the speed with which you achieve this understanding of the context behind the problems and outcomes, is equal to the speed to which you can put yourself in a position of influence. And I say influence very carefully because this is not about persuading somebody to buy a product. Being in a position of influence is to help shape the choices and the decisions your buyers are going to make about how to solve their problems in a way that will enable them to achieve certain business outcomes. That's influence. That's not persuasion. You want to be that trusted advisor that's influencing those choices and decisions. That comes from discovery. So bottom line is, you can't influence what you don't understand. You really can't sell if you don't understand the context of the depth of the problem the buyer has within their business, and again, what they're trying to achieve as a result of solving it. So you think about the demarcation of where selling really starts. Selling really starts when you're at a level of understanding the context of the buyer's problem. The problems they need to solve, the desired outcomes they're trying to achieve. And the faster you can understand, then the faster you start assuming this position of influence with the buyer. And this is really important, right? This is about credibility. It's about trust, which I'll jump into in just a second. So how do we tie discovery to influence? Well, first of all, discovery is very different than most sellers are taught. Discovery is not a one-way street. It's not me asking questions and you, the buyer, giving me answers. Discovery is actually a two-way street. It's actually an exchange of value between you and your buyer. Your questions that you ask are a source of value to the buyer. If you're asking the right questions, which that's not a set list of right questions, as I'll get into in a bit. But if you're asking the right questions that are forcing the buyer to think more deeply about the problems they're trying to solve, the challenges they have in making a change, and the outcomes they want to achieve, then what you're doing is you're giving them more insights into their problems. You're demonstrating some acumen, and that has value to them, right? So you are delivering value through the questions you ask, not just receiving value from the answers you're getting from the buyer. So we talk about insights. Yeah, I think back to my careers I was dealt in a lot of different complex industries, and it wasn't like I was an expert in all of them. But I sort of gained credit from the buyers of being knowledgeable enough to be able to help them through the questions I asked. So I was delivering insights through the questions I was asked. I learned about my customers' businesses. I developed my business acumen in large part from asking questions of my buyer and listening to the answers and asking more questions and digging deeper. So Gartner had a survey they did now 5 years or so ago where they surveyed C-level decision makers and stakeholders about their interactions with sellers, and fully 80% said they found little to no value with their interactions with sellers. And that really, when I read that, I thought, well, that's not a problem. The fact the sellers don't know enough is that they're not asking questions. You know, my career, as John pointed out, starting off selling women's shoes, but selling to some of the world's largest companies, dealing with CEOs and C-level executives in those companies. They never once thought I was asking too many questions, because that's how I wanted to understand. That's how I learned how to understand. And it's through asking those questions, just to take it a step further, is that your customers will tell you how to sell to them. They'll teach you the things that are important that you need to know if you keep asking questions. So insights, acumen, and all leads to credibility. You don't need to be an expert in every field to develop credibility. It's the questions you ask that they judge you by, and that sort of it leads to what their perception of your acumen is, and that gives you that credibility. Oops, my slides are stuck here. And that then enables the trust that puts you in a position of influence. Not every seller on a deal, if you're selling on a deal and there's 2 or 3 competitors, not everybody's going to be able to get this position of trust and influence. But if you ask the questions, you go deep enough, as I'll share with you in a second, you can get to that point. And that's really your goal, is through discovery, not through presentations, not through my knowledge of the product. It's through discovery that I attain this position of influence. And here's a key point to understand, because we talked about discovery being an exchange of value. Feeling understood is a huge source of value to your buyer. Feeling that the seller really truly understands what they're trying to achieve, what their problems are, understands the context, that's huge value. They feel understood. Those studied sociology in college, remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs, feeling understood is one of the critical human needs that people have. Well, it's true of your buyers as well. Excuse me, if you go back to that Gartner study, it's not, again, that the sellers didn't have all the complete encyclopedic knowledge about that customer's business, but if they ask the right questions, they can make that C-level executive feel understood, like, oh yeah, here's somebody I can do business with because they understand my challenges. That's the position you're striving to get to with discovery. So what should the focus of your discovery be? I'm going to talk about this in 2 terms, one sort of in general and then about in today's business environment. In every opportunity I've worked with over my career, and that's what came to this understanding after being in sales for about 10 years, but there's always one thing. When you're doing discovery, your job is to find out that one thing. There's one thing that's always more important, one problem, one pain point, one challenge that's more important than all the others. And this has been uniformly true throughout my career, selling hundreds of millions of dollars worth of orders. And it's not always the biggest problem, certainly not always the most strategic problem. But what it has in common is it's the one thing that key decision makers and stakeholders care about the most. So think about that. There's always one key item. Now, let me give you an example. So early in my career, selling satellite communication systems, and the largest cruise line in Asia at the time said they wanted to be the first to put high-speed internet browsing into the staterooms, individual cabins, as well as voice-over IP services. And we were running sales for a startup. We were, well, low mature, about $50 million in sales, but this was such a big deal at the time. It was close to $10 million. This was 25 years ago, is $20+ million deal today. And we were competing against these multi-billion-dollar technology integrators. And the cruise line had hired some consultants, some experts in satellite communications. We all know what happens when they're consultants on a deal. And they created this elaborate specification requirements document that had must-have items that ran 300 strong. I think the number was about 315 in this what they call compliance matrix, right? You had to say, did you comply with each one of these required features and specifications? And I looked at that and told the salesperson on the deal, I said, look, we can't compete with the big guys on this, but there's always just one thing. What is the one thing here? And fortunately, he had a great relationship with the CEO of the cruise line. We got on the phone over the course of a couple calls. What we found out is what the CEO is most concerned about is that on board each one of his vessels, there was a casino. And so he wanted to know to the minute how much money he was taking in via the casinos, because that was the real moneymaker on the cruise lines. And he wasn't able to do that today, or at that time, with the technology they had. So we made the decision that instead of putting together a proposal that focused on 315 line items in the compliance matrix, we were going to put together a proposal focused purely on this one thing that the CEO thought was more important, which is how do we create a link to each of the ships that would never go down, that had built-in backup and hot swaps and so on. So they had 5-9 availability on this communications link so that he could always have access to the cash coming in. And we won the deal, going away. And we ignored virtually 3/4 of what was on the document put together by the consultants, because that was the one thing. And I could go on and talk about every deal virtually I've worked on that had that one thing there. So your job is find that one thing, find it fast, dig deep, ask the questions. Again, I'll share with you some techniques for that in just a second. Now, in today's business environment, there's sort of a twist on that, because now we're focused on speed to value, right? Quick wins for buyers have become more important. We're less likely to see customers undertaking these huge transformation projects. The future's still a little uncertain, though we've got some light at the end of the tunnel. With economic situation still, got a fair amount of uncertainty attached to it. And so what buyers are looking for is, I said, these quick wins, something that's a near-term priority that fits within their strategic framework of what they're trying to achieve as a company. But today, the one thing provides a fast ROI with low risk. Quick wins, right? And so as part of your discovery effort, you have to find out what is the one thing that provides that fast ROI. There's that most immediate pain point, something that, yeah, it's part of their overall strategic direction, but something near term that needs to be taken care of. That then becomes the focus of your discovery. So when you have this focal point that you uncover and you understand the context behind it, right? It's one thing if you just uncover, oh, this seems to be more important to them, but you don't understand the context behind it in terms of what it means for them in a very quantifiable sense, then you don't have the power to make that argument to say, this is what we need to solve now. But if you understand the context, if you understand, I said, the quantification, which I'll get to in just a second, then that puts you in a huge position of influence to help shape the decisions the buyers are making. So I call this the fastest speed to value. That's what the one thing looks like for many companies today. And I've seen numerous examples of that. Again, you may have some upsells later down the road when they feel like more confidence in the environment, they feel more confident in investing, expanding, but everybody has these pain points. The world doesn't stop because of what's going on outside. So I spent some time to talk about the discovery mindset, because this is important when you get into discovery, is because I think we train our sellers the wrong way to think about it as this one moment in time we do discovery. Back to the Gartner study. If you're talking to a C-level executive, do they want somebody that's comes across saying, I know everything in the palm of my hand? No, what they're looking for, what your buyers are looking for, they're looking for people that are curious, people are open-minded, people are problem solvers. And so if you enter discovery with that mindset of saying, look, I'm here as a learn-it-all versus a know-it-all. Yeah, let's take a minute and think about that. Is when we use our scripted questions, as we so often see and hear in discovery, is what you're sort of conveying is when you don't have that extra curiosity to take it a different, a level deeper, is you're basically telling the customer, yeah, we got this. I know what you need. Yeah, I've seen a million people just like you. And this is one of my huge pet peeves in selling, because I believe that, yes, it's great to put together our personas. It's great to have some foreknowledge of the people and the environment we're selling into. The fact is that every situation is unique. Every individual we're talking to is unique. And we need to be very sensitive to that. So we can't say, look, I've got 10 questions I'm going to ask. I'm going to ask those and that'll be it. And I'm going to move on to the next stage. No, you gotta be more sensitive. You gotta have a little more emotional intelligence and say, yeah, I'm here sort of a blank slate, and I'm really curious. I'll make sure I understand the complete picture. So I'm a learn it all versus a know it all. Do something unique. Ask questions you don't know the answers to ahead of time. Don't be afraid to veer off the script. I was listening to a recorded call. This really struck me. It was about a little over a year ago. Relatively senior rep doing AE, doing discovery call, and sort of routinely going through the scripted questions that they had. And he would ask a question, buyer would give a response, and he'd say, uh-huh. There's a pause, because you could tell he was writing down the answer, recording the answer, and then would go to the next question. And oftentimes the buyer was leaving the door ajar to say, look, ask me more about that, because there's a lot here for you to learn. And encouraging the seller, and the seller wasn't taking the bait. So you can't be afraid to go that direction and ask questions you don't know the answers to. That is the very heart of discovery. It's not confirming what you think the truth to be based on past experience. For that type of buyer, you're selling to people, not personas. Each one's unique. Go off path, ask questions you don't know the answers to. In addition to which, taking it a step further, ask questions your buyers don't know the answer to, but should. Yeah, as you get experience selling in your field, you're going to come across lots of customers that have interesting ways, perhaps they've dealt with certain problems, interesting solutions they've come up with. But if you put that in the form of a question to a customer, and they're like, oh, I hadn't thought about that, it's like you gain credibility. So don't be afraid to ask questions you don't know the answers to. Another thing you want to avoid is make sure you're always sticking to questions in your discovery calls, or on the portions of calls you're doing as discovery. A tendency I hear on recorded calls, again, is a seller will ask a question, the customer will give a response, and the seller will say, oh yeah, we can do that, and then launch into basically a pitch. So you want to avoid that. You want to stay on the track of questions. And one way to do that is that maybe you ask a question, customer, and they say, yeah, we really need to be able to do, let's say, ABC, just that's some sort of feature or thing they want. Then if you want to sort of fall into that mode of saying, okay, well, I want to make sure I communicate to them that we can do ABC, is pose it as a question. Anytime you serve a discovery call, you have this temptation to lapse into making a statement, phrase it as a question instead. Oh, well, interesting, Mr. Kessler. So you said you do ABC. So what would be the value to you, to your organization, if you could do ABC? Or what would the impact be? And then from there, that opens the door to more follow-up questions. This is sort of asking questions sort of a journalistic fashion. I call them quantifying questions, but sort of the who, what, where, when, and why, and how questions. But when you're in discovery mode, is you don't just want to understand, yeah, the customer wants to do something. You understand what the impact is, what the value is. You want to quantify that. If they say, yeah, we want to achieve a 3% increase in market share through using this product or service, great. What's that mean in terms of dollars? Or we want to increase, revenue X amount. Fine, that's great. So what's that mean in terms of dollars? Ah, interesting. So if you want to do that, does that mean you have to hire more staff to make the more sellers? Ah, interesting. So how many more sellers do you have to hire? And what sort of time frame would you have to hire those? What sort of load would that put on your ability to onboard? Keep going, understand the context, quantify everything so you have this bigger picture. As I said, this really builds your acumen, builds your credibility with the customer, saying, oh, this guy understands the bigger picture. Ask what I call dual level impact questions. There's a Nobel Prize winning economist, psychologist, Herbert Simon, unfortunately passed away a while ago. But during the 50s, 60s, 70s, doing a lot of research into how people make decisions. And one of the things he found is that people process decision-making on two levels. One is if they're in a corporation, one is what's the impact of this, or what's the value of this decision, or making this choice for the organization, and what's the impact on me if we make this decision. And everybody does this. You do it in your decision making as well. What's this mean for the organization? What's this mean for me? And so you need to ask those questions. You need to understand, if you understand the full context of the decision that the buyer, you're asking the buyer to make, you got to understand what happens, what the impact is on them as a personal level as well as a corporate level. So if let's say there are 5 stakeholders in the decision, actually it's 10, because everybody's got 2 different viewpoints. So your job is you're trying to shepherd them through their buying journey and build a consensus around a particular solution. You need to have both of those influences in mind. Excuse me. So you need to make sure you ask and you understand ahead of time, if you understand the full context, what's in it for the company, what's in it for them as a stakeholder. And when you listen, listening is, right, at least 50% of a discovery is listening, is you have to listen to understand. I know we've used the word a lot, but we have this tendency these days, especially as we get more distracted, and there have been some studies on this, is that our tendency is to listen. Let's say we ask somebody a question, is to listen with a view toward responding. We're thinking about how we're going to answer and respond to the other person's response. And that's very destructive when you're trying to do discovery, because you're not thinking about what they're telling you. You can't gain a full understanding. So this is really an instance where even though we're talking about speed to value and speed to influences, you need to slow down for a moment. So when you've asked a customer, a buyer, a question, and they're giving you a response, you want to develop the habit of pausing after they've finished speaking and give yourself a chance, a one Mississippi, if you will, to process what they said before you either ask your next question or give a response. Because it has to be in context with what they're talking about. So you're listening to understand. And this understanding is also hugely important, because this is how you also develop empathy and communicate empathy for the people you're speaking with. Empathy is really truly a listening skill, because it's not about identifying purely with how the people feel. It's understanding why people feel the way they do. And you only get that if you listen. So you're listening to understand, not to respond. And most importantly, I think, along this line is, it's tied to the listening to understand, is asking great follow-up questions. And this really becomes the key in many respects to discovery, is you can ask your first question and you're going to get an answer. But a couple of things. One is, maybe it's just me, but I think in general, we're always better served by being just a little bit skeptical of some of the answers we receive from our buyers. And therefore we need to follow up and make sure we truly understand where they're coming from, because everybody always has an agenda. It's not being too cynical, I think, but everybody has an agenda. We need to make sure we work through that. But also people want to share more information if they're given the opportunity to share. And so when you have asked a great question, the customer comes back with an answer, you want to dig deeper. This is where the real gold is for you. So a great follow-up question is something as simple as, oh, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. Tell me more. Or my friend Michael Bungay Stanier, who wrote this fabulous book, The Coaching Habit, has what he calls his AWE question. And what else can you tell me about that? Ah, that's very fascinating. And what else can you tell me about that? And you can get in the habit when you're doing discovery to string 2, 3, 4 of those together with a buyer. You ask, oh, it's interesting, tell me more. And the answer, and you're still not entirely clear exactly what they're talking about, ask it again. Interesting. Maybe vary it up, use the "and what else can you tell me" question. But don't be afraid to keep digging. As I said before, I've never had a customer or a buyer tell me, stop with the questions already. They want to share their knowledge. They want to make sure you understand because they're talking to you for a specific reason. Because they need your help, right? If the buyers could gather all the information they wanted online and never talk to a salesperson, they would. But they're talking to you because they need to talk to you, because they need something from you that they can't get from looking at your website or looking at a user review site or what have you. So you're there. They want some value from you. Part of that value is your understanding of what they're going through and their problem and how you can solve it. So follow-up questions really become critical. Last bit is discovery in physics. This is sort of a fun thing I wrote about 5-6 years ago and got quite a lot of response. And so I'm not a physicist, but I wrote about that time. Is Werner Heisenberg, people may or may not know, was a German atomic scientist, nuclear scientist in 20s, 30s, 40s. And he came up with this idea of the uncertainty principle, one of the components of which we called the observer effect, which he found through testing that the act of observing a process necessarily changed the outcome of that process. And it sort of applies to sales, and especially in discovery, is that the act of buying changes your buyer. As they go through their buying journey, they're getting educated, not just by you, but by all the other vendors they're talking with. They're getting smarter about the problem they're trying to solve. Part of what you're doing is you're trying to help them define and understand the problem and the challenges they have. Part of what you're doing is you're educating them about the potential and the possibilities of what they can achieve by investing in your product or service. And you've got your competitors doing the same thing. So they've gotten smarter throughout their buying journey. They're not the same customer they were at the beginning. So if you had discovery as a discrete step in an early stage of your selling process, and you said, oh, yeah, we did that, the buyers moved on from that. They're not the same buyer later in their buying journey they were at the beginning. And if you're not keeping track of that, if you're not continuing to ask questions and doing discovery, then that's a problem, because the buyer's perception of how they can solve their one thing has evolved. And it's the sellers that stay on top of that understand that discovery, as I said right at the beginning, is not a one and done process, but is something that's done at every interaction throughout the buying journey that you have with the buyer. Up until the very last minute, you're asking questions. You're trying to complete your understanding in order to increase the probability of winning their business. And this thing sort of scares, especially some sales managers, because they like to think, well, we seem like we're in a good position right here. Don't disturb them by asking a question that may cause them to think. No. You want to keep asking questions. You want to keep adding value to their journey through the questions that you're asking, the insights you're delivering through the questions you're asking. And you get rewarded for that because, again, it increases your probability of winning the business because you're keeping current with where they are in their journey at that point in time. Ask questions until you win the deal, because you can never have too much understanding. As I said, I've had customers kick me out of their offices, but I've never had a customer kick me out of their office for asking too many questions. It's just the opposite. Just a quick summary. You can't sell if you don't understand the context of what the buyer's trying to achieve, their problems, what they're trying to achieve. You can't influence them. You can't become a trusted advisor to help shape the choices and decisions they make without that understanding. It starts with finding the one thing that's most important to them. And these days, finding the one thing that provides a fast ROI with low risk, high speed to value. Discovery happens on every interaction. It's not a step in your selling process. It's not a discrete step. It's something that happens throughout the length of the customer buying journey. And understanding the context and making the customer feel understood is a key source of value for them. So as John said, I'm the host of Sales Enablement with Andy Paul, where you find the best conversation sales 3 days a week. You can find it on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And I thank you for your time.
Awesome. Thanks, Andy. That's so cool. We've got some questions here, and I'll surface these as they come in. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask live, be sure and drop them in the Q&A there.
Should I just leave my big picture of my face up there for everybody?
As you like. You can stop sharing if any which way you want to do it. So
stop sharing.
A couple of questions that have come in, and I'm really interested to hear the answers to these as well. But one of them is there one thing, even in a buying group of like 6, 7, 12, 30 people?
Yeah, there is. And because there's this assumption in buying groups that everybody's voice is equal. And the fact is it's not, right? Not to evoke the name of our sponsor here today, Consensus. Yeah, we have this idea, and it's really, I think, sort of a myth of consensus decision making. And Professor Steve Martin from USC did a study a few years ago, I think in conjunction with what at the time was DiscoverOrg, now ZoomInfo, looking into the dynamics of buying groups. And what he found is that, yeah, if you bring 10 people together, personalities emerge, and there's people who are dominant personalities that influence the course of the conversation. And that is also true in stakeholder groups. So your job is in discovery is to find out who those, I think he called them bullies, but who those people are, and find out what's most important to them, because they're going to have outsized influence on the ultimate decision.
And they're going to have a one thing, and so they're the one thing that you're going to try and discover.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Let's see, we have a question. How do you transfer knowledge received between different sales, like i.e. BDR to sales, sales to account management, etc.?
I mean, if they're participating on the same opportunity they're working on.
Presumably, yeah.
Well, certainly you'd hope that's what they're using Salesforce and CRM for in part, but also I think on larger opportunities is you have to meet and talk and see what people have learned. There's no substitute for getting an A and SDR together, or however the team is that's working on a deal, and transferring that knowledge in person. But I also believe that you have to use your CRM system effectively, take notes, make sure you put those notes into Salesforce, and make sure that people are keeping current in reviewing it. Still there, John?
Sorry about that. Had a brief pull away there for a second.
Okay.
Technical glitch.
Yeah, but I think it's collaboration. That's the key, right? In sales, it's just like you're collaborating with your buyer. You got to collaborate internally as well.
Absolutely. Okay, here's another one. So as prospects engage later and later in the buying process, how do you reset a prospect who thinks they know everything and isn't interested in investing time in discovery?
Yeah, well, you're going to run into all sorts of types, right? Everybody's unique and an individual in that. But I think that's where your questions come in, because if you have, through experience, questions that you've asked previous customers that you think are really important to ask, and the customer should know the answers to, and I've had this, and I call these questions you should ask your buyers that they should know the answer to but don't. And for me, that's the tool I use. And so, like in my consulting business, it worked with CEOs improving the productivity of their sales team. So I had a very specific question I'd ask, because they all thought, well, I know what's going on with my sales team. And my question was, well, okay, on average, how many hours are you investing to bring a deal from initial point of contact to a deal, to a close? None of them ever knew the answer to that question, even though they thought, yeah, we've got this nailed. But that's just an example, right? So that started a conversation, which then led to an opportunity where actually they found out they didn't know as much as they thought they did. So that's one tool is, do you have these insightful questions you can ask that force them to pause and think? But also caution people is I think there's some truth, but some mythology to how far into their buying process people actually are and customers actually are. and I think one resource you should look at is when Gartner did their research 2 years ago on the buying journey, their buyer enablement study, they called it. They put together this famous flow chart that was about the buying journey. It's hugely complex, lines all over. They call it the spaghetti diagram. But at its heart were 4 jobs buyers are trying to accomplish through their buying process: identify the problem, explore potential solutions, define the requirements, select a vendor. I think that's a little broad, but in general, those 4 jobs. And I'll tell you that most times when buyers contact you, they don't really understand what the problem is yet. They may have researched your site, your product, and so on, but they really don't understand. This is what I was talking about. They don't understand the full context of their own problem. They need your help to do that through your experience and insights and so on that you can bring to the table. So just be a little skeptical of this idea that people are that far into their process.
Awesome. This is what I'm excited to hear the answer to is, do you have any examples of dual impact questions? Like, how do you address both decision makers, it's in quotes, both decision makers
Right.
with the questions that you ask?
Well, I mean, I think that is just as sort of explained in the study is let's say, I don't pick, consensus, right? I mean, it could be your product that you're selling. Is if you have a specific capability that generates a certain outcome for them, right? Is say, well, that's interesting. So what would the value be to, because you're could be early stage discovery. Yeah, what would the value be to your organization if you could have this capability? And yeah, you want to dig down a little bit deeper, do follow up. What's that mean? In terms of how you quantify what the value could be. And then you follow up with, interesting. So how would this affect your job on a day-to-day basis? What would the impact be on you personally if you had this capability? And just have them think about it. Oftentimes, they haven't thought about it consciously. They have subconsciously, but surfacing it is hugely valuable information. Benjamin, I love this quote, Benjamin Disraeli, who's a 19th century British prime minister, but also a famous author and very thoughtful person. Yeah, this quote that you hear and see a lot these days, which is, he with the most information wins. And that's what you're getting. These are just more data points. I find interesting that at the same time that we're obsessed with data and sales, we're generating all this data because of the tools we have, which provide much more transparency into the activities that we're doing. But at the same time, we're sort of forcing scripted discovery on sellers, which is the opposite of collecting the data, right? So really want to do both. We want to have all of our data that we have from our tools, but we want more information and data points from our buyers as well. And that's up to you.
Cool. I actually have a follow-on question to that because I'm really interested in this. We find that very often when you're selling a solution into a company, there's you see the political side of things, right? You see the political side where somebody wants to own it coming in if they're really excited about it, or somebody, if they're not excited about it, they're hesitant about being the owner of this and so on. And this dual impact question thing is really resonates just from what I've seen.
Sure.
What we find is that, like you say, people have impact for the company that they're concerned about, but also how does it advance my career, right? And what would you say is, I mean, I'm wondering if that's the one thing for everybody, right?
It's not insignificant.
And so I'm probably not for everybody, and hopefully not for everybody. But so that's that question was really interesting to me because how it's not easy to go in and say, now what's the impact on the organization and how would your career be forwarded if this is successful?
Well, but that's why I talk about what would be the impact on you, right? What would the value be to you? Let them talk about it in a more career standpoint. But the important part is they're thinking it. Whether you ask it or not, they're thinking it, and it's having an influence on the decisions they're making. So you're much better off trying to understand that. And that may be, this is, taking a step back, it may be hard to get that answer from people at first. This is why we really have to pay attention. And there's a lot written about these days, which, I'm very dismissive of people writing about, relationships aren't important in sales. You don't need to be likable, which is just BS, straight BS as far as I'm straight out silly, because you can't get the answers to some of these questions unless you have some sort of connection at a human level with these people. So you need to be able to develop these connections to earn the right to ask these questions and get the answers. And this is where building rapport, having empathy, making these human connections is so critical, because your ability to successfully discover rests on that.
I love that phrase. That was kind of revelatory to me when I first heard it, about earning the right to discover. Because I'm in marketing now, but I've been in sales in the past and so on. And that was as a young person in sales, you're like, all right, everybody tells me discovery is awesome, but they don't want to tell me the answers. Why don't they want to tell me the answers? Why do I feel like I'm imposing on
Right.
them and because I was imposing on them because I hadn't built enough,
Exactly. And and so the people that sort of are dismissive of this value of connection, what they're assuming is that if you ask them a question, they're going to give you an answer. No, it doesn't work that way in real life either. I mean, outside of sales.
Right.
And so, it's not like we've got two sets of laws of human physics. I mean, it's all one.
So last question looks like here, because we're getting towards our hard stop. Last question. What can you give an example of how you revisit discovery as you go along? Like what's some of the language that you use as you are trying to revisit the building content stage?
Yeah, I mean, part of it could just be as simple as, hey, look, I just want to reconfirm, right? On our last call, we left it thus, and thus. Before we get started today, I just want to reconfirm that this is what I understood, and this is where we're starting at today. And I said, that's a really simple one, right? Other ones is you may have questions of, I don't call it increasing complexity, but you may have those in your quiver that you ask at certain stages of the buying journey, especially as you talk to more senior people. And so here's a point I want to make the serve somewhat related to this, but I have a rule of thumb. And in general, somebody's got a big deal, you're working on a big deal, and you want to bring your manager in to talk to, and then maybe you're going to bring your VP in. And every time they come in, they tend to say, well, tell me your story, right? To the buyer. Well, why should the buyer do that? So my rule of thumb is that your odds of winning a deal decrease in proportion to the number of times you ask the customer to tell you their story. And so as a seller, your job is, this is why you want to keep asking the questions throughout the process. You want to keep digging deeper and making sure you really understand the context so you can inform your manager and inform your VP. So when they show up to help you and support you on a deal, they're digging right into the business. They're getting to the good stuff. They're not asking the customer to go through ground they've gone over before. Because what that communicates is a message that your management doesn't really trust you. And so as a seller, hugely important for you to have the credibility with the customer is you ask those questions, you get that information, you communicate it internally, and you'll be perceived better both by internally and externally.
Fantastic.